Throughout COVID, Australians learnt many things about the ugly side of politics, and that came to the fore for three Indian men who travelled to Australia for a family function. Their visas were revoked and they were detained for 110 hours, all because they weren't travelling with their stated travel companions. Joining us once again is the Informer's political editor, Anka Sahin, to discuss the bureaucratic madness exhibited by Border Force. Welcome, Anka.
Hi, Michael.
Now, surely all Border Force and Immigration had to do was check on their systems to confirm that the men's spouses had decided not to come because one of the three partners weren't granted a visa, and that would have taken, what, 5 minutes? Or am I wrong to think that it's that simple?
Well, obviously, this is a much less publicized case compared to what happened to Novak Djokovic back in January. But the parallels are definitely there. And in fact, what happened to these three men is exactly what happened to Novak Djokovic. But we do not have access to the full details of the conversation that took place and the questioning. I mean, what shocked me was the fact that they were saying, the three men were saying, that they arrived around 5 p.m. in Perth, and they were pretty much questioned all the way to midnight that day for something so simple as, hey, your wives are not with you. And we're talking about three men, as you said. One of the spouses, they all applied together, if I understand correctly. The article isn't the most comprehensive, but what I understand from the information provided is that they all applied together, and 5 of them got their visas, and one spouse was refused or didn't get processed in time. It's not clear, but one spouse did not have a visa. So the other 2 spouses made the decision to stay behind. I guess they were showing some sort of solidarity with their friend who wasn't given a visa. And the men decided to travel together. And I'm sure in 7 hours of questioning, this would have been made clear by the three men why they weren't with their wives, and the circumstances having changed since the time they obtained their visas. But it just sounds like, to me, whoever was handling the process there, whether it was Border Force or Immigration, they somehow had it in their minds that there was something dodgy going on, and they were determined to bring that out somehow. And that's what led to the whole thing.
Yeah, the 7 hours questioning not only seems excessive, but we need to ask, what was the motivation? You're an immigration lawyer. What do you think was going through their minds? What was the motivation or the suspicion that they had for these gentlemen?
Well, the only clue we have from what's in the article, again, without the full transcript of the conversations, and those full transcripts, perhaps the immigration lawyer of these three men would have potentially obtained from the department, because remember that those transcripts were made available for the Djokovic case, and if these men went to judicial appeal, they would have asked for the same as well. But just the only information that we could see from the article is that they were asked whether they were in Australia to work illegally. So one of the suspicions, and that it may be that there were multiple suspicions, one suspicion may have been that they were there to work illegally. The other thing, which I think is much less likely for arrivals from India, they may have suspected that they were potentially going to put in a bogus protection visa claim once they were allowed into the country. But that's not mentioned in the article. I'm just thinking that could have been in the back of their minds, potentially. I mean, otherwise, I just can't see any justification for giving 3 tourists who are there to visit family for a family function in Australia such a hard time over something so simple.
Yeah, and there's no requirement for them to actually be traveling with their spouses, because people's circumstances change all the time, don't they?
Yes, absolutely. No requirement at all. I mean, when they applied, see, visitor visa applications are always individual applications, so people don't apply together as in one application. Each person applies on their own, including children. So each of these 6 people would have put in a separate application. They may have grouped together the applications for the just for ease of reference for the department. And in that application, they may have put in that the intention, because one of the things that you put in with a visitor visa application is just an indication of what your plans are and what your timetable and itinerary is going to be like once you're in Australia. So they may have put in some of that information and said, the plan is to travel as 3 couples. And when they turned up, the men just on their own, obviously a flag went up somewhere, and this whole the questioning began.
Now, the reporting also says that they were denied access to their phones and luggage. Is this normal practice? Because I could imagine the confusion and the concern that this would cause if you were there to meet the men and transport them or, pick them up, and suddenly you don't know where they are. How is that normal practice, Anka?
Yes, it is normal practice. That's exactly what happened to Novak as well when he arrived in January, and he went through the process, and his visa ended up cancelled. And it was even worse for him because he arrived after midnight, and he was basically backwards and forwards with the immigration officer until 5 a.m. in the morning. At some point, obviously, his visa ends up getting cancelled. It's only after that, I think, you're allowed to have access to your belongings and to your phone. And by that stage, of course, you're taken into detention, and there isn't any more they can do for you at the airport. So even if you are given access to your phone at that point and you were able to call either your family or your lawyer or somebody, there isn't anything they can do right at that point to help you. Obviously, there is a process available if you want to appeal the cancellation. But as these 3 men found out, it's quite expensive and stressful. Thankfully, they won. But yeah.
And these people, and I hate to use the differentiation, they're not Novak Djokovic. They're not people of great importance. So do you think Claire O'Neill, the minister responsible for Border Force, needs to answer questions about this? Like, it's definitely not a good look for Australia.
It isn't, and I'm surprised that it hasn't gained greater coverage both in Australian media and also in India. Perhaps in India it hasn't been picked up yet. I would imagine that it would raise a few eyebrows if Indian media did pick it up. Yeah, I mean, look, this sort of especially, look, anytime a decision is made by a delegate of the minister, and I'm talking more specifically about immigration cases, and where the person later goes to appeal, whether it's merits review or judicial review, as in this case it was judicial review, and the decision is overturned, that's an indication that the initial decision was poorly made. And it was never justified to begin with, and it gets thrown out either at the merits review stage, as the case may be, or at the judicial review stage. So clearly there is a problem if many of these decisions are being overturned at appeal. There's a problem with the quality of the decision making at the initial stage, and that's something, yes, definitely the minister responsible for the portfolio needs to look into.
Yeah, and there's also reporting around the matter that immigration lawyers in Perth were reluctant to take up the case against Border Force, and it took Karina Ford in Melbourne to actually help them out. And I can only assume it would have been an expensive exercise, but the men won in the end. Who wears this cost?
Well, they can. They obviously have to meet the costs initially to engage a lawyer and to go through the process. If they win, they can ask for the costs to be given back to them, and that's obviously for the judge to determine. In this case, it sounds like from the article that they're also separately asking for compensation. I'm not really sure how well that's going to go. I mean, having now won their case. The interesting thing with these sorts of cases where visa cancellation happens at the airport, Michael, is that many of them just do not go to appeal. Firstly, because it's very expensive. And secondly, you have a limited time to engage somebody and to do this. And the lawyer that you engage must quickly apply for an injunction to stop your removal from Australia. That those sorts of injunctions are routinely granted, and it was granted in this case as well, to stop your removal, because otherwise, once your visa is cancelled, you're taken into detention. The department is required to remove you from Australia, basically put you on the next flight and get rid of you as soon as possible. So the only way to stop that from happening is by applying for an injunction, and for that you need to, well, get hold of an immigration lawyer. Clearly these men struggled to find somebody who was prepared to take on their case at short notice. This sort of, I mean, I can understand it to a certain extent, because obviously it's a massive imposition when you know, somebody comes to you and wants this sort of attention basically straight away, and you may not necessarily have availability in your schedule to be able to take on something like this. And I can imagine that that's what happened in this case. And Karina Ford, who you know, we know from the Biloela case in Melbourne, she runs a larger practice, so she probably had the resources available to be able to take this on at short notice. And luckily for the men, it worked out well in the end. As for compensation and costs, well, who knows where that's at.
All at a time when Australia's desperately needing to attract immigration, both in the tourist and in their skilled worker. This can only do us more harm.
Look, it's just not a good look, and the more these sorts of reporting gets out and people find out about it, it continues to an image of Australia as basically a fortress where most people, including tourists, are treated with a level of suspicion at the border and at airports. You could say, you know, guilty until proven innocent, and you know, unless you satisfy us as to your bona fides, even though you hold a visa, we won't let you in. Now, theoretically, you might say that the same is true for any country and for getting into any country, but where you have visas being cancelled and people appealing that outcome, and the court saying that the department was in the wrong, that's just a very, very bad look. And especially at a time, as you say, Michael, especially at a time when the tourism industry is desperate for even one more tourist coming to Australia to spend their tourist dollars.
Yeah, and even when the court was saying, yes, the Border Force got it wrong, and then having the minister come over top of that with ministerial discretion, as we saw with Novak's case, again, you know, due process isn't really upheld.
That's right. The Novak case was really bad in that regard. You know, the minister had clearly made up his mind not to let him in regardless, and basically came up with an excuse, or with a justification that you know, at the end of the day, and I discussed this at length at the time, he came up with an excuse that he was likely to incite a portion of the Australian society to not be vaccinated and things like that. It's such a unconvincing argument. But the point was, he didn't even have to make that argument. The powers that a minister has to cancel a non-citizen's visa are pretty close to absolute. So, you know, the minister could have easily cancelled his visa for a second time and said, I'm not even going to give any reasoning. I just don't want him in Australia. And the minister of the day has the power to do that. Obviously, in this particular instance, there was no second cancellation. But we also don't know from the article what happened with whether they were released back into the community to carry on with their family function, or whether they just gave up in disgust and went back home.
Yeah. Well, all right. Australia, lift your game. We're looking bad. Anchor Sahin, our political reporter, thanks for your time, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Michael.